Welcome to this special Birkbeck Arts Week event with Deborah Levy. I'm Julia Bell and I run the MA in Creative Writing at Birkbeck, and I'm really delighted that Deborah has agreed to join us virtually today. Deborah is one of our most prolific and celebrated authors. She works across many forms and genres, from novels to short stories, plays, poetry, to her recent series of living autobiographies. And her most recent novel, The Man Who Saw Everything, was published in the summer of 2019 and was on the long list for the Booker Prize. I'm going to speak to her today about this book, but also about her living autobiographies, and also, I think, a very relevant question, which we've been thinking a lot about this term on the MA, the temporal and its relation to both fiction and non-fiction. I also have a couple of questions which the students have emailed me to ask on their behalf. So, Deborah, welcome. Hello. I'm just going to pin you so that we can see you. One of the things it seems to me that fiction can do especially well is represent the subjective experience of time. And Einstein said the purpose of time was so that everything doesn't happen at once. And in your novel, The Man Who Saw Everything, you seem to embody this idea of a character who's experiencing the events of his life all at once. He's moving through time, but also floating in the space of his consciousness. You kind of remove the clock almost altogether, and consequently the book has a really interesting sense of circularity rather than linearity. And I really wondered how you approached writing that. Did you set out with this idea that this was going to be the structure, or did it emerge through the writing of the book? And I think this was a question also some of the students were very curious about, was how you sort of approached it.
Right. Well, I think we should mark this time now in this interview, because historically it's happening in May 2020 at the time of a pandemic. And so within this pandemic are many others, you know, the Spanish flu in the first 20 years of the 20th century, and anyone who's gone to Venice will be familiar with those kind of those plaid masks with the very long noses. I saw one actually in Oxfam today.
Isn't someone walking around Crouch End wearing one?
Well, it had strange resonance actually. It was sort of just there with a kind of straw chair and a Christmas bauble. So if we're talking about the temporal, there was sort of Christmas and Venice, and that long-nosed mask in which you stuff herbs. And I was going to buy a pint of milk at the newsagent's next door. So all thinking is porous like that. And you're either going to let that fall into your writing or you're not. And when I first started to write, to plot The Man Who Saw Everything, just to look at how it was going to travel through time. And there are going to be some spoilers here for those who haven't read the novel. I thought, well, what would happen if I ended the book 7 seconds before the main character dies? What does that mean? You know, so he's conscious. He is conscious. And then I said to myself, and 7 seconds after that last sentence, he dies. So that was the sort of beginning of thinking about time. And then much more schematically, because really to play around with time, you do have to be kind of schematic. I thought, right, it's going to be set in 1988 and it's going to be set in 2016. And both those times are going to be reflected in each other like a mirror with a crack down the middle. 2016 is going to appear, haunt is the word, haunt 1988, and 1988 is going to haunt 2016. And so to make it manageable for myself, I had these 2 sections, and then I was going to cut, as it were, through them. I didn't really know how to do it when I first started writing. So start with place and start with time. So, you know, it starts with 1988 Abbey Road, London, and see what happens. Start with an iconic place, a humble national monument, which is the Abbey Road crossing. So that was important to me because most national monuments or heritage sites you can't touch. You certainly walk over them. So I liked it that it was everyday and humble. During the pandemic, by the way, they have repainted the black and white stripes of the Abbey Road crossing.
Yes, because nobody was crossing it.
Exactly. And there's a part of me that sort of thinks, so you've really ruined my book because it's so well worn. It's so, you know, it was so well trodden. That was quite important.
And I'm interested in this idea about haunting. I mean, that was my second question, really, about what Mark Fisher might call the hauntology of the text. And I know that comes from Derrida, but I think what I understand it to mean in Mark Fisher's terms is the way in which echoes of the past always haunt the present, but very specifically the cultural present. So the details in your book of the 60s, Abbey Road, Penny Lane, the divided Berlin, events which don't just haunt your characters, but perhaps also it's a generational kind of haunting. There are things that are very much still in the historical past, but they're still very much part of our present. And you use these details in a very pointed way, I think.
Is exactly. So isn't all time like that? But how do we actually, if you like, because we have to give shape to that in a novel? How do you work with a sort of with the flow of that haunting, that cultural haunting? So Annie Ernaux is good at that, isn't she? So
oh my God, yes, that's what's so great about The Years. It's what beautiful.
Exactly. So she writes a memoir that is a collective memoir of the France she's living through over a whole number of decades, but that's also a personal memoir. But because I'm talking to your students, maybe it's important just to say some simple things, you know, about writing, because time is what the novel is about. You know, and so backstory for me is incredibly important if I'm going to play around with time. Some of that backstory ends up on the page, but quite a lot of it doesn't. So I'll make a judgment as the author on about that. But actually, I couldn't really play around with time without that backstory. The backstory of every character, the backstory of its the cultural times that are going to make an appearance in the book. So why? Because then there's a kind of pool that can unspool. There's a pool of sort of data that you can unfold and work with. So an example would be, just from the top of my head, if you have a character see a frog and the character shudders, we can choose as writers to explain that shudder, to really explain it from a backstory, if you like, or not to explain it at all. Either decision has to be working for the reader. So you might explain it in another way. There might be something else that makes that character shudder, and it's connected to the frog. There's a connecting conversation or not. So that frog might go back to 1966, might go back to 2017, might go back to, I don't know, 1066. Depends. But the backstory was really important. And so a lot of my writing is is to do with that reveal and conceal, and lots of backstory isn't actually.
Do you feel like you wrote a ghost novel then, that sort of sits behind the actual novel, that is not present in the text, but is stuff you need to know for the purposes of the book having coherence?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think the other thing I wanted to ask you about, to just sort of dive into the character of Saul a little bit, who's our central character in The Man Who Saw Everything. He loves both men and women, and he's really unable to make a commitment to anyone. And I thought the way that you use the Berlin Wall in the story, in some ways quite symbolically, for his divided attention and his divided self. And you talk about him as being a narcissist. And he's certainly very self-involved, and his narcissism seems quite connected to his inability to make commitments. And psychologically, I thought there was a really interesting point about how he's floating so much inside his head that he couldn't connect to the time frame of other people, particularly perhaps Jennifer, but also with the other characters. And I was wondering whether you were interested in investigating narcissism as being connected to our experience of time. I mean, in that way that narcissism is a disorder of the temporal. We can't understand the times of others. We can only understand our own sort of experience, the flow of time.
Yeah, it's not really so, the narcissism isn't really connected so much to time as to the title, The Man Who Saw Everything, which is a very strange title. It has to hold a lot, that Cold War-ish title, okay? So narcissists can't really see themselves. They have to see themselves through the adoration and admiration of others. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about male authoritarian leaders in my time now who have some of those traits. So so that was in the air. With Saul, his problem is with attachment. And that's something that deeply interests me in all my writing, whether it's attachment to place, attachment to someone else, attachment to things that aren't good for us and that we need to separate from, always an interesting subject. And all our fear of attachment, you know. So I'm never kind of wagging my finger in a book. And I'm not judgmental in my writing, because that seems to sort of close everything down immediately. Then you might as well write a pamphlet.
Yeah.
So the novel offers this incredible place to roam around in your own thinking, complex thinking. You know, when you say something like that, you go, yeah, well, of course. But actually, I think we find it quite hard to hold two contradictory thoughts.
Well, that's Keats's negative capability.
Exactly. And we have to accept that we need to do that when we write a novel. We have to hold 3, 5, 7 contradictory thoughts. See where they take us. So that's the adventure, right, of writing for myself. It really is. It's like, where is it going to take me? Where does it feel true? There's a point in the writing where I kind of stop and I say to myself, do you believe that, Deborah?
Yeah.
And if I don't, I delete it. It doesn't matter that the writing took me a long time and I think it stands. I just delete it. I remember that in Hot Milk, when I had Sophia, age 26, apparently leave her mother in the middle of a road in a wheelchair because her mother has limb paralysis.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know, so what am I saying? Is she a psychopath? Do I believe that? And I realized that I did psychologically believe it, but there was some more work to do. She had to know that her mother could stand up and walk away.
Yes.
How was I going to show the reader that? So there was another chapter. There was a chapter before that scene that I had to write. So that's the sort of pleasure of it. Is, you know, if you're going to turn the flame up, then you earn it. You sort of think, no, wait a minute. Let's you know, it's just it's just so infinite and interesting. But where were we?
No, I love that. I was just thinking about that relationship in that book. I love the relationship between her and her mother, particularly in that book. It's by turns kind of horrifying and amusing and convincing all at the same time. And of course, the mother can walk. We know this somehow all the way through. There's just that sense of the sort of domination of the horrible mother and her sort of explicit fear or something. I don't know. This is great. I love the way that you've portrayed that.
Yeah. So in the writing of that, the reader has to also know, just as you say, that she can get up and walk.
Yeah.
Sophia has to know that too, but she has to know it less, she's got more at stake than the reader, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sort of strange game in the writing where she actually knows a little bit less than the reader.
Which you're allowing the reader to know more than the central character. Yeah.
Absolutely. So Saul Adler, he's got a problem with attachment. He's a loving man. He feels a lot. It's not like he's without feeling.
Totally.
But he's sort of unable to. He's really unable to commit himself to anything. He even calls himself a minor historian. Doesn't want to be a great historian, historian.
There's also tragedy in that somehow. Also, somehow, I feel sad for him at the end of the book. I mourn him in that way.
Yeah. Yes, because if you're going to write a Saul Adler, he has to feel all kinds of things, and he has to get things wrong. I like characters who mess up. I think there is this idea that we have to sort of be emotionally literate and get things right, and well, we do some of the time, but a lot of the time we don't. And so that interests me about him. His detachment interests me. Detachment as a subject, as well as attachment, obviously, interests me. So at the end of the book, Jennifer Moreau, who he's been arguing with for
all the way through
30 years, she's 23 when the book starts and approaching 60 when the book ends. She says, "You were so absent and so detached. The only way I could reach you was with my camera."
Yes.
So then if we sort of go back to the beginning of the book, she's a young art student, and she's in love, and she's trying to figure out how as a young woman she can have any sort of, how do you do being in love and not being totally engulfed by Saul Adler? How does she keep her sense of purpose? How does she do the things she wants to do in the world with a Saul Adler at her side?
Do you see her detachment as being a necessary kind of artistic position? In a way, what we're saying about negative capability requires a certain kind of detachment, that the writer has to sit not above things. I think more in a Simone Weil kind of way of sitting and looking at things with great attention and no judgment, and that's the way to sort of preserve a sense of looking or being able to see.
Yes, I mean, it's not entirely with no judgment. That would be too cute, because I have arguments to chase. I'm a political writer. I have arguments to chase in my book, and I do indeed chase them. But I think that if you do have things to do in the world, as she does, and you have a sense of purpose, actually anyone who has a sense of purpose will have to figure out how they do attachment too. And that's, yes, so that's part of the 30-year argument. He says we were reckless and we didn't have a clue, but I never stopped loving you. And her thing is, well, I had to run away from your love as fast as I could to do the things I needed to do in the world. And I find that tragic. I mean, that's really sad.
That's quite an interesting feminist question too. I just want to move us on a little bit to ask you about your living autobiographies, because they talk about the times, perhaps, rather than time more. And I'm curious about, I find it funny that they're described as living autobiography, as if somehow you have to stop living to write an autobiography. But I wonder, I mean, in both Things I Don't Want to Know and The Cost of Living, you capture yourself very much in the midst of life, you know, the moment of moving through things. So you take this interesting writer's position of observing the world while at the same time writing about it. And I wonder how you achieve that, being able to live and watch yourself living. I mean, perhaps that's the writer's position, but I'm interested in how it came about.
I think it is the writer's position. I mean, you know, you can't sort of write with no living. And well, the living autobiographies are so called because they're not written with wise hindsight at the end of a life. And sort of looking back, and this, you know, they're written in the storm of life. They're raw. They're written quite close to the events that are evoked in the book. So that was important to me. I suppose the hardest thing about Things I Don't Want to Know and The Cost of Living, and I'm now halfway through the third and final part of the Living Autobiography project. The third book is called Real Estate. And
that title.
Do you?
Yeah, I had a poem called Real Estate, but I'm sure it's nowhere near as good as that.
Oh, okay.
Great. I love that. That phrase is wonderful.
Real estate.
Yeah.
Well, was the first thing was to kind of find a formal and intimate way of speaking to the reader. Because there's nothing worse than a just sort of outpouring of stuff. There is this idea that in autobiographies, you know, you have to sort of somehow reveal and confess and divulge, and well, you could just critique something, couldn't you? Who says that's not an autobiography? And then I discovered about that so-called genre is that the kind of autobiographies that most interested me were really about other people. So as I was really writing about more about other people than I was writing about myself. And then there is this very interesting decision to make when going on the road with those living autobiographies. So there is an I in that steering the story, steering the critique, steering the haunting, whatever you want it to be. That's quite like myself, but not exactly myself. We have to create a avatar
persona
to steer those books. Whether to sort of refer to the I as the narrator, that felt a bit odd, but I tried it out for a while. So the narrator is now in a village in the hills above Mallorca, and I thought, yes, I am in a village in the hills. So that really intrigues me, you know, that continues to intrigue me about this project. So.
And you're alternating, are you, between writing fiction and writing these projects?
Yeah. So I'm making notes for my next novel now. And I'm writing the third part.
Is there a difference? I mean, do you sit in the chair differently, or just have a different sort of mindset between the two kinds of forms, or are they're offering you very different canvases, I guess, to use an artistic metaphor?
Yeah, I mean, I really like to be entertained when I read. I think we should talk about that, because sometimes this is seen as something rather, you know, that sort of liking for wanting to turn the page is somehow a stain. I want to be entertained, but what does that mean? I want, when I'm writing a novel, I don't really want to talk about the novel I'm writing, but I'll talk a little bit about how I collect information. So I've been reading the diaries of Judith Malina, and she was part of a theatre company in the 60s called the Living Theatre. It's a very political avant-garde theatre company. And she describes going to a store in Manhattan, and a woman comes in, and she's devastatingly beautiful. And as described by Judith Malina, there's about 6 lines in this book. She has a high European accent, whatever that means to Judith Malina, I don't know. She's not American. And she says to the shop assistant, "Have they arrived?" And he says, "Your glazed apricots have not come." And she then touches her throat and she says, "And are you well?" And she leaves. And Judith Malina realizes that she's Greta Garbo.
Aha!
So that absolutely stays with me for my novel. It's what stays with me. Have they arrived? What a fantastic line, you know. Then I love the way that she touches her throat and says, "And how are you?" So there's so much said and unsaid in that gesture and in that sentence that sort of really appeals to me. So waiting for something to arrive, that'll be a note, you know, in my notebook. That's how I'll be working on for the novel. I'm also looking at Joan of Arc.
Oh, wonderful.
Why? I have no idea. But the Passion of St. Joan of Arc, there's this wonderful, the film, the famous film, there is a line in which a man of the church says to Joan, "Has God made you promises?" I thought, what a great line. And then I put that in my diary, "Has God made you promises?" And I think to myself, I'm not a religious person, but I think, has God made me promises? I think he has. And I start to write those down. So that these are the early working stages. I don't really know what I'm aiming for, but it's but I'm alert to something that I'm reaching for. And I'm not quite sure where it's going to take me. So those are the two notes.
I think it's an openness, isn't it? It's about the position, learning as you get better at writing. I think that being open to those things that really have tickled your sensibilities, or they've kind of shown you something, or you've really noticed it and you need to do something with it. It speaks. I certainly find that.
I think that there is this idea that when we write books, that, so you have your hand and you're just going to use your little finger. But I have to use all 5 fingers, right? So what does that actually mean? So in terms of time, Julia, I'm probably more tuned into William James, who taught psychology to Gertrude Stein, actually, at Radcliffe College. He adored her, thought she was his most intellectually stimulating student. She was this large, rollicking character. And so it was James who really invented that term, streams of consciousness. So, I read quite a lot of James.
I'm curious about your reading, because I think for me, one of the things that really is very distinctive about you as a writer, particularly in our sort of cultural moment, is how much of the European influence is in your work. That you're not sort of, in a way, I mean, I know you just mentioned him, but you don't write to the Americans, I guess. Maybe I'm being partial about that, but you seem inspired by European literature.
I do write to the Americans. I think that Audre Lorde, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, all the beat writers, actually, they're hugely influential. But it would be true to say that I cut my teeth on European literature. I don't know how that happened, but I started reading Genet. A Lady of the Flowers. And I just thought, I was just so blown away by his poetry and his hard, brutal realism. So the poetic with brutal realism is a palette that I like. I'm influenced by cinema. I'm more influenced by David Lynch than Jane Austen. I'm more influenced by Bergman, maybe, than many other writers. Although I am rereading at this time of the pandemic D.H. Lawrence, and I'm rereading Women in Love.
Okay.
What I'm so enjoying in this reread is his description of minors and men. He calls the thick glamour of maleness. He was very eroticized by men, Lawrence. And so that's another interesting thing, isn't it, about how we read. We return to books and we're interested in different things. Like, I think when I read that book in my 20s, I was interested in how he was going to work with the women. And now I'm just interested, now I'm just sort of touched that he's a miner's son. And he's looking at his people. And he really, those passages are just so exquisite. So, Baudelaire, Apollinaire, Marguerite Duras, Kafka, then Irish, Beckett and Joyce, Keats. I love Keats often. I often read Keats, the poetry of Keats, just for a change of mood, Then we have theory. So Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, Paul Gilroy, Mark Fisher, Hannah Arendt.
How do you find that feeds into your work, the theory? Because obviously we're not writing theory, but it gives you something. I don't know quite.
Ideas.
Yeah.
How appalling to read a book with no ideas. A story with sort of no ideas. So characters, I mean, I know people don't usually talk about writing like this, but it's how I talk about it. Characters are just consciousness. I mean, you're creating a consciousness. What else are you doing? Well, I don't know. So all of those books really stretch thought.
Yeah.
Let it wander around. They're chasing something, and they're chasing coherence, right? But there's so much incoherence in between. That's the sort of pleasure of reading all of that. Apollinaire, I read for maximum entertainment and sensuality and irreverence. And as I've often said, Baudelaire, I wish I had written Flowers of Evil. I would have liked, I'd like to have had that under my belt before I put my teeth in a glass at the bedside table. So yes, absolutely European literature. And my reading is a mystery, actually, even to myself. I in lockdown, my comfort read, as I've written somewhere, has been The Unspeakable Confessions of Salvador Dali. It just makes me laugh.
Well, there's something really lovely about the way that you use humor, I think, throughout your work as a way of kind of leavening, but also being able, I think when you can make people laugh, they listen or they learn or they hear or they think in a way that isn't sort of burdened by a seriousness that can sometimes be overwhelming. I really do. I think that's one of the things I really love about your work, is that balance between humor and seriousness.
Yes.
Which is what makes it wonderfully readable, but also sort of leavens it somehow.
Thank you very much. Well, imagine a life with no laughter in it. I mean, just imagine a face that has never sort of, where the lips haven't sort of turned upwards, or we haven't physiologically made the sounds that we need to make when we laugh. I suppose just to go back to the European influence, they're not anti-intellectual. There's a sort of pride in intellectual endeavor. It's not seen as pretentious. So that's when I first started reading those books, that was very clear to me, and I like that seriousness. Then reading Beckett, who is such a comic writer, because my training was in theatre.
Yes.
So we had to actually say those words out loud, not just read them on the page, and that became very clear. And that action of actually reading back pages out loud. Sometimes I do that, not always, but it really helps when I'm stuck. I can sort of tell where the thoughts got tangled, and I can tell when the cadence is not quite right. And I think the theatre training also helped me embody ideas, because when you're writing for actors, you have to do that. You very quickly learn when a line just dies in a writer's mouth, and you quickly, I learned very quickly to edit and rewrite. So ideas are of no importance whatsoever if they aren't embodied. If they, I mean, that would be in any kind of writing, and you're very good at that in your essayistic writing. I'm such an admirer of your essays, is that you really embody an idea, walk it through, take it as far as...
Well, I really heard what you said about going to Crouch End and then seeing all of those things in the window of the charity shop. And for me, life is very vivid like that. I can see, you just look at a view and you can see 3 or 4 telling things about what's going on your street just by looking at what rubbish there is outside. I sometimes feel that one notices things in a way that's sometimes not necessarily that helpful, but it's helpful.
Indeed, yeah.
I've just got one more question for you, which is from Katie Packman. She wanted to know about, and it goes on from what you were saying about philosophy, really. She wanted to know what your response, also have you expand on your response to something that you said in a TLS interview, where you were asked what your writing field will look like 25 years from now, and you said the most likely to survive the age of the screen will be esoteric thought streams exploring death, wish, desire, disappointment, and despair. It will be the new commercial fiction. And I think she wanted you to just expand on that. I wonder whether it's just going to become aphorisms on Twitter, but that's another issue.
Yes, I mean, I think that who asked that question?
Katie, her student.
Katie, it's a sort of joke as well, because that's supposed to be the most uncommercial and most unpublishable writing. But actually, I do think it's sort of what we want to read. We really do want to know about mystery and enigma and why we are like we are, and why our desires are so big or non-existent. And so I think that esoteric thought streams, where I'm just sort of playing around there, but I think that you have esoteric thought streams while you're in the bath or when you're sitting on a bus, and that everybody actually does too. And so actually Allen Ginsberg had this excellent quote about writing poetry, which is something like, poetry happens when we are alone in the dark, thinking the thoughts we really think, making the private public, something like that. And it's so hard to think the thoughts to accept the thoughts we really think, never mind write them. But when we do, something exciting and exhilarating and of value to others begins on a good day when we don't burn the toast. It happen.
I think sometimes when I'm teaching, I feel like I'm getting students to listen to those thoughts, or to pay attention, to write in a way that gets them to actually start to hear that stuff that gets edited out in the busy rush of whatever. And maybe in lockdown, actually, the thing that we've got at the moment is heaps of time to listen to ourselves. It's quite strange, this time. It's making people feel soporific, it's making them feel tired, it's making them feel, I don't know, done something interesting to my sense of time, for sure. And
Yeah,
the way that I see my own thought processes as well.
Yeah, I can't wait for it to be over. I have to say, yes. I mean, we were talking earlier about the difference between isolation and solitude, I do long writing hours in solitude, but I don't do long writing hours in isolation. Somehow, the world needs to be alive to be in solitude in it. So for example, I get my best ideas when I'm alone in a crowd, kind of thing. It's very hard to talk about the pandemic while we're living through it. I don't really have anything more to say about it, except that fresh air and just sort of now and again you catch someone's eye and they smile at you, and it means it's somehow heightened, because of the time that we're living through. I'd be interested to see what people are going to write. Are you writing about the pandemic?
Yeah, I've written a couple of pieces. I've written one thing about bread, the lesson of the loaf being the idea that yeast is blitzed in the oven at the moment of being cooked, and there is almost a fossil, like a loaf of bread is a fossil of that moment when everything died. All the yeast dies and you're left with this, whatever the shape of it's going to be, which I find quite interesting. And also the time. I think we're all having to live in the present tense in a way that we're really not used to. Because we can't have a future tense because we don't know what it's going to look like, and also maybe in the past tense too. I think there's a lot of self-archiving going on Facebook and social media, which hopefully we're going to talk about with Marina in a couple of weeks, because I think there's something interesting about that. But Deborah, thank you so much. This has really been lovely to have you in my kitchen. I feel sorry that we couldn't have a proper conversation at Birkbeck in the real world. I'm hoping maybe we can do that again in the future.
Thank you for your great questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Deborah.